If you're a high performer looking to grow and make an impact, but feeling stuck, underappreciated, and burned out at work, you're in the right place. I'm Melissa Vining, and this is the Job Search for High-Performing Misfits podcast. I help high performers leave draining jobs behind, reclaim their careers, and land roles in organizations where they can thrive. Tune in for tips, insights, and inspiration for your journey to fulfilling work that fits you. All right, welcome back to Job Search for High-Performing Misfits. I'm your host, Melissa Vining, and today my guest is Charles Kransberger. Charles is a career coach and talent consultant who is on a mission to create better workplace for both neurodivergent professionals and the organizations that hire them. He brings an amazing perspective to this topic because he works on both sides of the hiring table, so coaching high-performing neurodivergent job seekers and also helping companies build neuroinclusive hiring and retention programs. So Charles, I know that you love to say that you're passionate about helping businesses embrace authentic neuroinclusion. And I really love that perspective because in order for businesses to really benefit from this, it can't just be about checking the box. It actually really has to be a culture shift within the organization. And I think the idea of authenticity really goes both ways because we want the job seekers to be able to show up as their authentic selves in the job search and in the workplace. And we want employers to really authentically embrace and appreciate those individuals for who they are. So today we're going to talk mostly about this from the job seeker perspective. And the goal is going to be to give our listeners some really practical strategies that they can utilize in their job search. And one of the great things that I think our conversation today is going to do for people is not only for the neurodivergent job seekers, but for everyone who is in the job search process and going through this, you're going to be able to benefit from these strategies. So welcome, Charles. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Melissa. Appreciate that very generous introduction. Happy to be here.
Yeah, of course. So I wanted to start off by talking a little bit more about how listeners can begin to define what they actually need from a workplace in order to be successful and to thrive, because this is something we want people to do at the front end of their job search before they even start researching and applying for jobs. And a lot of people really struggle with this. And I think this is true not only for neurodivergent job seekers, but really for everyone, because maybe they just either don't know that they should be doing this, or they don't recognize how powerful it can be, or sometimes it's just honestly hard to do. So I think for a lot of people, especially for the neurodivergent community and maybe people who have been late diagnosed and they've spent a lot of time just kind of struggling, but not really knowing why and not really knowing what they need in order to be successful and to thrive, this can be even more difficult. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how you coach your clients to move past the idea that their last job was just a bad fit to something that's going to be more tangible, where they're actually identifying specific supports or communication styles or work environments that are going to help set them up for success.
Perfect. And I love the way that you put that in terms of the last job wasn't the right fit rather than I wasn't the right fit for the job, right? Because I think that's the really important nuance, and how you can move forward in a productive way is telling yourself that kind of a story, right? Because I think so many times with the folks that I've worked with who might be autistic or ADHDers or dyslexics, I've seen some stats before about how many tens of thousands of times these folks get told throughout their lifespan, especially growing up, like, what's wrong with you? Why, everybody else is fine with doing this. Why can't you do it this way? Why can't you get it together? This kind of a notion, right? And when you hear that thing 10,000, 20,000 times, some version of that, you can internalize it as it's me who's the problem, right? Versus the reality, which is for any of us, almost every job is a bad fit for you, except for a few that are that right fit, right? So all the men in my family besides me are in the construction business. So growing up, as my dad and my uncles and my brother-in-law are exposing me to this type of work, I'm like, this is a really bad fit for me. Like, I would not thrive in this industry, right? And then my mom and sister are in the education space, and I've tried to follow their footsteps as a special education major initially. And after my third student teaching placement, I was like, this just isn't it. So it's about navigating those pivots and embracing the inevitability of some of that trial and error without losing enthusiasm or internalizing that as, oh, there's something wrong with me, and it turns into this snowballed effect of learned helplessness, is like the technical term, right? Where they're assuming anything that they're going to try, they're going to mess it up, right? Versus when you increase the probability of success by trying to find that intersection of what are my skills, what are my interests, and what is my labor market fit, and a fit that is conducive to the lifestyle that I want to live. That's where you can find that intersection and try to embrace your strengths. And again, that's a story that many of these folks haven't heard, is that strength-based perspective of ADHD, of autism, of dyslexia, and other neurotypes, where it's this spiky profile notion where, what are my constellation of strengths, what might be my constellation of relative support needs, again, in a given environment, and how can I leverage those strengths and address those support needs. So that's the type of conversation that's often really helpful for folks, whether it's folks who were late recognized and having this conversation more mid-career, or folks who are trying to launch their career and maybe streamline that trial and error process a little bit.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it sounds like you're really focusing on the strengths part of it. And then that really helps, I guess, guide the direction on where to go. And I think we also recognize that there are going to be some challenges as well. So is that part of the conversation that sometimes you'll have with job seekers around what have your challenges been in the past, and how can we find some place that maybe minimizes some of that or is able to accommodate you better?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there can be a comparison of, again, how did your strengths and potential support needs interact with your previous work environment, and how can we forecast how they're likely to interact with your next role and next work environment. And it's always helpful context, like you said, to get that history of what's been a pain point before and what's worked well for you before, and translating what that could look like in your next role. So sometimes I'm working with college students who might be on the verge of graduating or recently graduated, and they're like, yeah, I've had accommodations in a K-12 environment and a college environment, but I have no idea how this is going to translate in the workplace, right? Like maybe they had time and a half on exams in college, but there is really no equivalence to time and a half on exams in the workplace. So translating, again, what are your barriers that you may be likely to experience in a given environment, and how can we address some of those support needs. And maybe they have one idea in mind of what that could look like, but maybe there's a menu of some other alternatives that we can explore as well. And some of these things are things that ideally they can take into their own hands and not have to go through those formal channels of like submitting an accommodation request, and then depend on the employer to be responsive and empathetic and flexible during those conversations. Like ideally, this is something that you'll be able to have ownership of and mitigate that need for disclosure and accommodation, and these typical channels and systems that are so often discussed.
Yeah, I think that makes so much sense because when you come into it really understanding what you need, then a lot of times you're right. Like you said, you can just kind of self accommodate or ask for these things in a way where you're not necessarily having to go through that whole formal process.
Well said.
So, I also wanted to talk to you about how one of the things that you do in your consulting work is that you help to connect job seekers with neuroinclusive employers. And I think this is such a big benefit for job seekers because a lot of the times we're talking about this intentionality within the job search process. You know, I want people to be able to approach this with more intention by identifying these are the things that I need, these are the things that I'm looking for, like we just talked about, these are my strengths, this is how they might be able to get plugged in a workplace. But then once we have that, we have to figure out where is the workplace that actually aligns with those things. And I think for a lot of people, that part can also be really difficult because there's no guidebook, there's no list of employers out there, which I wish that I could just go ahead and give you a list because it would make it so much easier, but it's
Right.
it's such an individualized thing, and also it really depends not only on the employer but the sub team and the manager, and there's all these different factors. So can you talk a little bit more about like how you're able to help people connect with employers that might be the right fit for them?
Absolutely. Yeah, super common question that I get with my career counseling clients as well is it might be the Gen Z neurodivergent professional who grew up with this neurodivergent identity and were recognized early in life and have internalized it as a cornerstone of who they are. And they're like, I'm going to bring this part of me to the workplace proudly and unapologetically, take it or leave it kind of a thing. And I want my employer to be responsive to that and feel that congruence, right? Or it might be somebody who's more mid career and got recognized more recently and had a bad experience with a manager or a certain team and want to pivot to an employer that has more aligned values and again where that probability of success is a little bit higher. And to your point, there isn't a organization that I've encountered that you can say, yep, they did the thing, they're perfectly neuroinclusive, like you're 100% going to have a good experience there, right? Doesn't exist in 2025 as far as I'm aware. So when I get asked some version of that question, like where are the employers who care about this and how can I connect with them? It's about understanding where they are on that journey, right? So this conversation really started around 2013, where some large companies broke ground into the space, and it was initially this autism at work initiative and strictly a hiring program. And then organically, conversations took off within those organizations, and people were saying, okay, I'm ADHD and I don't need to get hired. I'm already at this company and I have unaddressed priorities and pain points. What about me? Right. And all these other different neurotypes and stakeholder audiences started to speak up, and it brought them from autism at work to neurodiversity at work, and not just a hiring conversation but that whole employee lifespan. So hiring, onboarding, how we're promoting and advancing people in their careers, how we're running our teams, and um, doing performance evaluations and hosting events, and that entire ball of wax that I would call culture, right? So if you're looking at some of those employers, if you're looking at one who has been on that journey since way back in 2013 and they're 12 years along that path at this point, they're probably going to have a more mature and comprehensive program than others who have just heard about this neurodiversity at work movement more recently and might be taking their first steps down that path, right? So if you see things like they're talking about neurodiversity on their website and social media, they might have an employee business resource group or employee resource group where they are getting feedback from the parents of neurodivergent folks and neurodivergent professionals at their organizations and incorporating that feedback into their culture. Some of those type of signals can help you say, okay, this organization on paper at least is on the path and has some of these different support systems in place and neurodiversity values that resonate with you. So those are a few things that I would always encourage them to look for. And as they're researching organizations before an interview, for example, are green flags.
Yeah, I just want to touch on something that you said there about culture, because I think that's such a big piece of this, where really a lot of the neuroinclusive practices that, like as a consultancy, you're trying to implement are really just good culture practices. And so you might even have some companies that are not necessarily focusing on neuroinclusion specifically, but because they're doing a lot of great work around building a good culture, they might end up being more neuroinclusive than someone who's not doing that work.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is what we in the space call just good hygiene, right? So what's good for neurodivergent folks is often good for everyone's. And it's also told in terms of the story of the canary in the coal mine, whereby understanding the pain points of your neurodivergence candidates and professionals, you by incorporating that feedback end up with a system that works better for everybody and just isn't just more inclusive, it's more predictive of business success, right? So an example of that would be skill-based hiring. And when you aren't just sitting down and having a unstructured conversation with somebody and hiring based on vibes and hiring the person that you might want to grab a drink with the most, then you are instead implementing the skill-based hiring criteria where you are seeing the skills that you need in a given role and on your team in action, and people with different communication styles or who may seem harder for you to relate to based on your communication style and their communication style interacting in that interview. But nonetheless, they've made themselves undeniable through those skills. That's something that's going to help you hire neurodivergent folks. It's going to help you hire candidates from other countries or might be English second language and experiencing other communication barriers, whatever the case may be. There's going to be other stakeholder audiences who benefit from that neuroinclusive design at a systems level. So yeah, there's always something in it for the businesses, even if it's just a kind of that greedy bottom line perspective. Like there's something in it for everybody.
Yeah, I would love to talk a little bit more about the skills-based hiring practices that you mentioned because it's definitely not a new concept, but I think it might be new to a lot of listeners. So let's break that down a little bit more. What does that look like? What does that exactly mean in practice?
So it's been a hot topic for years, like you had mentioned. And I think oftentimes the conversation starts with, okay, do we really need this degree type and this many years of experience for the role if the candidates have the skills, right? So I think a lot of organizations have de-emphasized those pieces about educational and work related background requirements on job descriptions. But in terms of actual process during the interview itself, that's where the implementation has lagged behind in terms of delivering that skill based hiring experience to candidates and hiring managers. So what we do in my consulting role is replace the traditional behavioral interview with a skill-based project that we design and deliver to those teams. So we have the managers fill out a survey helping us understand what are the skills that you need in this role and on this specific team. And then we, based on that information, will design a project that the candidates work on for a few hours that week and then present the work on that project to the hiring manager. So for example, I work with a design, build, construction, engineering organization. So they might give us a site plan for a project that they're working on, whether it's a highway they're building or a bridge that they're building, whatever the case may be. And then we'll have the candidates complete a few hours of work within their specific engineering discipline so that they can show those technical skills as well as some of those more soft or professional skills with their presentations, and just how they're able to communicate what they had worked on to a stakeholder audience. And then the hiring managers almost unanimously, give us feedback about, wow, this was amazing to see their skills in action. I feel very confident offering them the job. We should just be defaulting to this for everybody, right? It shouldn't just be this pilot project that we're working on. So that's been really exciting to see that momentum start to gather at some of these companies where skill-based hiring is being implemented in practice rather than just talked about in theory.
I think it's such a good representation of the fact that the show don't tell approach is so much more effective because you're actually getting this opportunity to really show what you can do rather than just tell it in a story format. And, in the coaching space, a lot of the times we're trying to encourage people to do this and to kind of take action on this on their own, even without the employer necessarily having this built into their hiring or interview process. So, can you talk a little bit more about that? Because some job seekers are going to be lucky to have the employer that's doing it already. But for people listening who are not in that position and maybe they're going into one of the more traditional behavioral style interviews, how can they bring this concept in with them?
Definitely. One thing that we talk about is preparing a portfolio, and you can do this for any interview, right? So you can show up, and when you get inevitably ask the "tell me about yourself" question. Maybe you have a slide deck pulled up where you have your skills outlined, you have your interests outlined, you have some samples of your past work that relates to the skill set indicated in the job description. And for a lot of the neurodivergent candidates that we work with, sometimes they're trying to store all of that information in their head and be able to deliver it eloquently, but then they get to the interview and the conversation turns out to be like, how was your summer? You've been on vacation lately? What are your holiday plans? That small talk, and it interrupts them being able to store and then deliver this well-rehearsed speech, and it can be very anxiety inducing, and maybe that distress doesn't enable them to perform at their best. So having all of that organized and having a portfolio contextualized to your profession, that you could be able to say, here's a summary of a project that I worked on that really emulates the skills that you need, that can go a long way to address some of those barriers that I hear about all the time.
Yeah, because like you said, I think that helps give it structure and it helps you make sure that you don't forget something or miss something that you meant to talk about. And then it also gives you that opportunity to actually show real samples of your work. So I would
Right.
think that most hiring managers who are going to see that are going to have a much more tangible thing to say, okay, this person is going to be good on my team because I see that they can actually do this. They showed me a real example of it.
Right. And then the candidate and hiring manager have some shared context to be able to build a conversation from, rather than trying to pull together a conversation out of thin air and make it from scratch, so to speak. Like you have some shared criteria that can be super helpful to launch that conversation.
Right. So by doing it at the beginning of the interview, it gives you that foundation to then build off of for the rest of the interview. That's awesome. So
Exactly.
I do talk about portfolios with the job seekers that I work with as well, and I always like to suggest this as a good strategy because of all the things that you said. But yet, I think there's still a lot of, I don't know if I would say fear, but there's just something about it that causes people to kind of stop and be like, I don't know, maybe that's not for me. And I think we tend to think a lot about portfolios in terms of the creative space. So we're like, oh, yeah, photographer, of course they have one. But if I'm not a creative, how can I possibly do that? So can you give us some suggestions on what that might look like in a non creative space?
Absolutely. And the caveat being, there is no one size fits all silver bullets solution, and I don't want to perpetuate the stereotype that all neurodivergent folks aren't comfortable in those behavioral style interviews, because there are some who prefer that kind of a format. There's a ton of dyslexic folks who I've met who are great verbal communicators and are like, yeah, I don't really want to do this whole project based, skill based interview because it feels like a whole lot of work that I have to do during the week. And I would rather just show up and be able to talk about myself. And maybe that works well for them. So understand yourself first of all and be like, okay, is this a useful suggestion for me, and am I experiencing this barrier or not, right? And then if you are, and you want to see what this could look like for you, think of it not so much as I need a dazzling piece of content that's just going to blow them away on the screen share, right? It's almost like, if you think about on your resume, you have your work experience listed there with those 3 bullet points kind of summarizing what you did. Just expand upon that, like in a slide deck perhaps, and you can think of it in terms of that whole star method. Like, what was the situation I was in, what was I tasked with doing, what action did I take, what barriers did I experience and how did I address those barriers, and ultimately what was the result, and how can I showcase that I understand the value I brought to the organization as a part of that result. So that's one really simple way to just beef up a little bit what you already have in your resume and be able to signal that value to the employers, and again build a conversation with the hiring manager based on that brief outline of a project that you worked on.
Awesome. Okay, so I want to change topics a little bit because for a neurodivergent job seeker, the first challenge is going to be getting the job and getting through this whole process. And then once you have the job, the next challenge is about actually keeping the job, which can be sometimes equally as challenging for some people. So, a lot of the times in that situation, it's not necessarily about the person's ability to do the job, it's more about the hidden expectations and kind of overall lack of understanding and appreciation, I think, of different neurotypes in the workplace. So, I know that in your consultancy, one of the great things that you're doing is what you're calling success coaching, where you're able to kind of support people through that first bit of employment to make sure that they are understanding all of those pieces. And of course, recognizing that, again, not everyone's going to be lucky enough to be able to have that kind of support. So I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about this and what happens after people get hired, and for a lot of us, we often end up masking to try to fit in these situations. And essentially, we're having to suppress part of ourselves in order to seem more neurotypical, which can come at a cost too. So, can we talk maybe a little bit just to start in this topic about masking and how a neurodivergent employee can be a little bit more proactive with this to reduce the risk of burnout?
Absolutely. So it's a process that starts before the interview and before onboarding even, right? So when you're researching the companies, understanding what are my must-haves and can I confirm that those are in place. So for some folks that I've worked with, the whole pandemic era work from home movement was the best thing that ever happened to their career, right? So in the workplace, like you said, maybe they were feeling this inclination to mask. Maybe the sensory environment wasn't working for them. Maybe the commute was really exhausting for them. And suddenly all of those things are within their control in a work from home environment. And they were even more productive and everything was great. And then all of a sudden there's this return to office movement. And you'll be able to see in your research process, if you're looking for a job in 2025, is this organization continuing to allow that flexibility for hybrid arrangements, work from home, whatever the case may be, or are they fully embracing this return to office movement? Because if you accept the job and then bank on, oh, I'm just going to request a work from home accommodation and yeah, maybe it'll be fine. Maybe not, right? So there are some ways to address burnout and support needs proactively before you're even in that situation. And maybe if you can't find that information during the research, maybe you bring that up during the interview as well. Like if being openly and proudly neurodivergent is you, maybe you bring that up during the interview and see how they respond. And if you don't get a satisfactory response, you're like, okay, this isn't the right fit for me, right? So it's one of those things about you're not only being interviewed, but you're interviewing the interviewer. Once you're actually in the workplace, that's where there's going to be inevitably a level of individual choice. And I think our role is to help make that as informed of a choice as possible, right? So you see some neurodivergent professionals who default to disclosure, and that's the best thing that they ever did. They don't feel that distress of masking and that incongruence between their identity and how they're showing up at the workplace. And they feel like they get a lot of empathy and flexibility that they didn't get before they disclosed, and that was the best decision that they ever made, right? Others disclose in the workplace and it doesn't go like that, right? And they feel like, oh, now people assume that I'm less capable than they did before, or oh, maybe I got put on a performance improvement plan and didn't get any of that empathy, and they're trying to get rid of me, right? So it's hard to reckon with all of the different stories that I've heard from folks that I've coached and try to be like, do this or do that, right? So it's about understanding again your individual role, the organization that you're with, your strengths and support needs, and then try to unpack from there, what are you going to do, right? And if you do need support, again, option A and the preferred option being what are some strategies to take these support needs into my own hands through some of these different resources and tools and strategies that I can implement. And then if you've exhausted that and the support need is still unmet, then what are those more formal channels that you can explore, whether that is the formal accommodation process or whatever that looks like. So hopefully that was coherent and answered your question. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think that makes a lot of sense because we can also think about this, like you said, it's so individual for every person, and there's no right answer because every person is going to have a different experience, and in every situation it's going to be a different experience. So I think by having some of the knowledge up front of, does this employer kind of understand, like have a baseline understanding of neuroinclusion and neurodiversity and neurodivergence, that will help you a little bit because you can think about it the same way as just everyday life. You don't necessarily want to walk around disclosing that you're neurodivergent to everyone you meet, because there are some spaces where that's not as accepted, or you're going to get a response that just makes you feel worse than you started. So it's kind of like doing a bit of this exploration first to find out, does this feel like a safe space to do this? And am I going to benefit from actually disclosing?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Again, it's a very personal choice, and I try not to steer people in any one direction, but rather see my role as helping them unpack, okay, what is your goal? And based on that goal, what are the potential upside and downside of disclosing or not disclosing, right?
Yeah. And I think also what you said, I want to go back to the example you gave about remote work, because that's such a good example and such a tangible example of the fact that if you know that having a remote job is very helpful to you in terms of being able to perform your best, then we want to be intentional at the beginning of targeting remote companies, not just any company, like you said, and just kind of hoping, oh, I'm going to negotiate this or it's going to work out for me, but really thinking, where are the companies that value this already, that have their workplace set up so that it's either remote first or remote friendly?
Right, absolutely. And I understand in a tight labor market like we're in, that can feel a little bit idealistic to, give that advice to our audience of what are your must-haves and what are your nice-to-haves, and make sure you're, filtering out for all of those must-haves, right? Because for some people, especially parents like myself, there's a bottom line economic reality of your career, and you may be making compromises in tight markets and difficult times economically. So yeah, I don't want to ignore that part of the equation. But if you are in a position to be able to do that research and really honor your preferences in that way, I think that is a helpful lens.
Yeah. And to your point, it's also about prioritizing those things, right? So you might have a big list of things that you know are going to be helpful. And then we have to think, what is the most important thing that I really need? And I'm going to focus there. And the other things, like if I can get, great. If not, we're going to make some compromises.
Exactly.
So, because you also do the consulting piece with organizations, I just wanted to do a little question about, if there are managers listening or allies who might be listening, what is one thing that they can do, maybe this week even, to help better support their neurodivergent employees that are already in their organization?
Good question. Yeah, and it's one of those things where I think managers are constantly being asked to do more with less, and it can be the punchline in a lot of these conversations in a way that isn't fair. So yeah, definitely don't intend this to be calling out managers or accusing them of discrimination or bias or anything to that effect necessarily. But I think one useful piece of advice that I would give them is, for so many that I've worked with, it's not about correcting an error in your work that you're currently doing. It's about potentially bringing a blind spot into view, right? In terms of 20% of your team, your organization inevitably is going to fall into this neurodivergent bucket of either being ADHD or autistic or dyslexic or OCD or bipolar or PTSD or whatever the case may be, right? Somebody who fundamentally experiences social dynamics, communication, sensory environments in a way that might be very different from you and maybe most people on your team. So if you understand that and develop the skill of being able to communicate and collaborate with all of those different people I just mentioned equally well, right? Like if you can have a conversation with the autistic person on your team and you can write emails and reports in a way that is easily digestible for the dyslexic folks on your team, that makes you a super communicator, right? So I think viewing it as a skill set that you're developing and having it not just, oh, I'm going to go do all this work on behalf of a small fraction of the population because I care about them, right? Like that's kind of the traditional framing. And I would reframe that as there's something very much so in it for you in terms of how you perform as a leader and how your team performs. So that's the reframe that I would offer, and just have the conversation. There's a lot of hesitation sometimes about jumping into these conversations. They don't want to say the wrong thing or don't want to offend the people, or we've used words in this conversation that I think are foreign to a lot of people. Some people are like neurodivergent, neuroinclusive, neurodiverse, neurodistinct. Like, what do these things mean? And it can feel intimidating to even jump into the conversation. So yeah, take that leap, be brave, have the conversation, and go from there. Like it's not something where you necessarily have to reinvent the wheel, but again, think of it as skill sets that you are adding, that there's clear value proposition for you and your team.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things in terms of having that conversation, and as you said, some people being hesitant or worried about saying the wrong thing, is just coming into it knowing that you don't know everything, and that's okay, and being able to be curious about it and to want to learn more, because if you're talking to a neurodivergent person, like they probably know a lot about it. So they can be able to give you some of that information when you approach it from that kind of place.
Well said. Yeah. Yeah. The spirit in which you and your conversation partners enters the conversation is a big deal and sets the stage for that to be fruitful. Yep.
Exactly. Exactly. So you've given us a lot of wisdom already, but I wanted to wrap up by seeing if you had any last words of wisdom that you wanted to share.
No, I appreciate that. And you're being very generous with your introduction and your summary here. But no, yeah, I think this neurodiversity at work movement is very interesting in terms of its evolution to be able to observe and see this at times two steps forward, one step back kind of evolution, and take stock of where we're at in 2025 and where we're trying to go from here. So yeah, for anybody in the audience, whether you're an organization who's interested in learning more and getting on that path, or if you're a neurodivergent job seeker who's feeling stuck in your career and wanting to take that next step but don't know how, yeah, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I would love to work with you and have that conversation.
Excellent. And is LinkedIn the best place to find you, or are there any other places that people can go to learn more about your work?
Yeah, LinkedIn is the best way to find me. I'm also a coaching provider on wiztherapy.com. And yeah, if you want to email me, coachcharlesllc@gmail.com. All great ways to get a hold of me.
Perfect. All right. Thank you for being here, Charles. This was so helpful.
Likewise. Thanks for having me, Melissa.
If you love this podcast, be sure to hit subscribe, leave me a review, and share it with a friend so we can help more high-performing misfits find work they love. See you next time.